Synopsis: a terrible and unexpected incident occurs in a tiny, picture-perfect village. A respected member of the community and loyal wife, Emma Hartley, finds herself at the heart of a murder inquiry following the unexplained death of her husband, Mark Hartley. At Mark's persuasion, the couple had recently gotten back together, but they were hiding some dark secrets that would eventually come to light. The formerly distinct boundaries between the victim and the offender become more hazy as the investigation goes on, exposing a story of betrayal, deceit, and retaliation. Story: Emma Hartley observed the rain pattering against the glass as she peered out of the kitchen window. She had usually been soothed by the repetitive melody, but today it just made her think of the tears she was no longer able to shed. Despite her agreement to the arrangement, Mark's betrayal had left a deep wound, and it was never what she really wanted. Mark's solution to his restlessness was the concept of an open marriage, which allowed them to travel new paths without entirely straying from their commitments. Emma had reluctantly consented, thinking it would help them get closer, but in the end, it had made them more distant. Emma's life shook the night Mark brought up the notion. As the sun sank below the hills, they were enjoying a warm glow from their chat on the porch. Mark seemed excited, his eyes glimmering, unaware of the agitation he was causing inside her. She had been in a relationship with him for more than 10 years, and the idea of parting ways with him was intolerable. Nevertheless, she gave in out of love and a fear of losing him. After a few months, Emma felt even more alone as Mark threw himself into their newfound freedom with such fervor. He would frequently stay out late, coming home with a distant expression on his face and a little perfume odor clinging to his clothes. Emma threw herself into her career and interests in an attempt to distract herself, but the emptiness still gnawed at her. One evening, Emma happened to come upon Mark's phone while cleaning the living room. Ignorantly left on the couch, it was vibrating with new messages. She opened it out of sheer curiosity and was met with a flurry of texts from a person going by the name of Sophie. The private texts were rife with inside jokes and arrangements for follow-up meetings. As Emma perused the emails, her hands trembled, every word piercing her heart. When Mark got home that evening, he saw Emma seated at the dining table with his phone open in front of her. The ensuing altercation was highly charged. After a moment of disbelief, Mark became enraged and accused Emma of violating his privacy. Emma, trembling with grief and betrayal, insisted on finding out Sophie's identity and her significance to him. She was even more enraged by Mark's evasive responses. "This is not what I wanted," Emma yelled, her face glowing with passion. "You succeeded, and you're discarding everything for her now?" Mark's eyes flickered with a trace of shame, softening his demeanor. "That's not how it is, Emma. All I needed was something fresh and unusual. It doesn't alter my feelings about you." But his statements seemed phony. The harm had already occurred, and Emma sensed something within her break. At that moment, she understood that she had lost him to his own self-centered goals, rather than to another woman. She had lost her affection for the man she had fell in love with, and was left with a stranger who prioritized his own pleasure over their shared life. Emma spent the next few days withdrawing within herself. She went about her regular business, being aloof and frigid in her encounters with Mark. Regardless of the toll his adventures were taking on her, he persisted in them. Their formerly lively house became into a quiet conflict zone as time went on, separating them more and more. Then, on a rainy night, the anxiety peaked. Mark arrived home late, his eyes irregular and wild from the rain. Entering the living room, he staggered and found Emma waiting. She exuded a sense of closure and quiet determination that eluded Mark's observation. "Emma, we need to talk," he stumbled and said, his speech garbled from drinking. She was on her feet, staring at him. "Indeed we do," There was an intense and never-ending argument that followed. Years' worth of repressed grudges surfaced, accusations flew, and tempers raged. Mark lost control and slapped Emma across the face with his palm in a fit of uncontrolled wrath. She staggered back, startled and wounded. But then, something inside of her exploded. Taking a large candlestick from the mantel, she swung it fiercely. Trampled to the ground, Mark lost consciousness. With yearning eyes, Emma stood over him, her actions finally dawning on her. With shaking hands, she let go of the candlestick and fell to her knees. The rain outside grew heavier, the storm reflecting her inner agony. After a spooky silence, Emma realized there was no going back. Investigation. Standing in the dimly lighted Hartley residence corridor, Detective Alan Brooks's sharp eyes soaked up every detail. The call, about a domestic disturbance that turned tragic, had came in late last night. This was a sight he had seen numerous times before, yet something felt different about this one. His eyes landed on Emma Hartley as she sat motionless on the couch in the living room, her face pallid. The candlestick, a somber reminder of the violence that had broken out here, was lying on the ground next to Mark's lifeless body. Mrs. Hartley. Brooks walked up to her and spoke softly. "Could you explain what transpired?" Emma's voice was hardly a whisper as her eyes flicked up to meet his. He assaulted me. I had to stand up for myself." Nodding, Brooks jotted down a note in his notebook. Though he'd heard similar tales before, there was something about Emma's attitude that piqued his interest. She appeared almost indifferent, as though the seriousness of the situation hadn't quite dawned on her. Was there anyone else who saw the fight? Glancing around the room for any other indications of struggle, Brooks questioned. Emma gave a headshake. "No, just the two of us." Brooks kept interrogating while the forensic team arrived and got to work. Emma gave consistent replies, but there seemed to be a tension beneath the surface that hinted at more. He made the decision to learn more, beginning with the history of the relationship. In the neighborhood, Mark Hartley was well known as a prosperous businessman with a captivating demeanor. Emma, on the other hand, was a reserved personality who was frequently eclipsed by her extravagant husband. On the outside, they appeared to be the ideal couple, but Brooks was well aware that looks might be misleading. He went to see the neighbors of the Hartleys in order to learn more about their relationship. Most said they were courteous, but never really close. Kind, but a little aloof. A few confirmed Emma's account of the open marriage by mentioning that they had seen Mark with other women. Mrs. Anderson, a neighbor, contributed a vital piece of the puzzle. "I noticed that they have been fighting a lot lately," Mrs. Anderson remarked in a low, secretive voice. Emma was getting more and more agitated, and Mark was constantly gone late. "I even caught a couple glimpses of him with a young lady. Her name was Sophie, I believe." After expressing his gratitude to Mrs. Anderson, Brooks returned to the station, his thoughts buzzing with ideas. The situation got more complicated if Emma's account of the open marriage and Mark's adultery was accurate. He had to track down Sophie and learn about her part in this awful story. Finding Sophie wasn't too hard. She worked as a waitress at a neighborhood cafe. When Brooks approached her, she appeared apprehensive, yet helpful. Emma was right to suspect that she was having an affair with Mark when she came clean. Mark mentioned that his marriage was almost terminated. Sophie clarified, her gaze lowered. "Emma seemed to be fine with it," he said, "but I couldn't help but feel uneasy." He rarely discussed her, but when he did, it was obvious that tension was high. When Brooks pressed Sophie for more information, she adamantly denied knowing anything about the circumstances behind Mark's passing. Her depiction of a man divided between his duties and his wants struck a chord with what Brooks had already discovered. After arriving back at the station, Brooks and his colleague, Detective Lisa Chen, went over the evidence. They presented the information: a broken marriage, an improperly open connection, and a deadly altercation. Still, something didn't seem to add up, Chen wrote, tapping her pen against her notepad. Emma's too composed. Why doesn't she seem more shaken if she acted in self-defense? This must be deeper than it seems, Brooks concurred. In an attempt to find the missing pieces, he made the decision to have an official interview with Emma. He could see the tension in her eyes as he sat across from her in the antiseptic interrogation room. Brooks said, "Hartley, I need you to be completely honest with me," in a tough yet sympathetic tone. "Do you know anything that we're not aware of?" With her hands clenched in her lap, Emma hesitated. "I have shared all of my knowledge with you. After we argued when Mark got home intoxicated, he slapped me." I simply responded. Leaning forward, Brooks fixed a sharp glance. "Emma, I think there's more to this. You must tell us everything if you want us to comprehend." Emma seemed like she might crack for a split second. She drew a deep, trembling breath as tears welled up in her eyes. "Mark, he wasn't simply betraying me. He intended to go away. When I learned that he was starting a new life with Sophie, I lost it. I promise, though. I didn't intend to kill him. It happened by mistake." Feeling that what she was saying was true, Brooks nodded. But he was aware that the inquiry was far from finished. There were still a lot of unanswered questions and a complex web of motivations and feelings to sort through. The feeling that the true narrative was merely getting started persisted as he left the interrogation room. Trial. The courtroom was alive with quiet exchanges and the sporadic shuffling of documents. The case had captured the attention of the community and the media. Emma Hartley was seated at the defense table with Julia Carter, her lawyer, at her side. Emma's calm exterior had given way to a noticeable nervousness, her eyes darting about the space as though trying to find a way out. Under the direction of District Attorney Michael Collins, the prosecution did not take long to portray Emma as a ruthless killer. Collins characterized Emma as a vindictive and jealous wife in his introductory remarks, one who was unable to accept her husband's decision to enter into a marriage and eventually leave her for another woman. He produced the tangible proof, which was painstakingly arranged to bolster his claims: the candlestick, the autopsy report, and pictures taken at the site. In response, Julia Carter told the story of a lady who was abused and betrayed by her husband, pushing her to the brink of despair. Emma's clean background, her past as a devoted and helpful wife, and the abrupt and violent turn of events in their relationship when Mark started seeing Sophie were all highlighted by her. Carter contended that Emma had acted in self-defense after being driven to her breaking point by a man who had destroyed their relationship. Witnesses testified during the trial, each adding a layer to the intricate picture of the Hartleys' marriage. Mrs. Anderson gave evidence on Mark's late-night antics and their regular disputes. Despite her emotional testimony, Sophie proved how much Mark had been lying and how he intended to leave Emma. When Detective Alan Brooks took the stand, he described his investigation with a detached sense of professionalism. He went over Emma's confession, the opening scenario, and the gathered evidence. Carter pressed Brooks to accept the abuse indicators and Emma's psychological damage caused by Mark's conduct during the cross-examination. Detective Brooks, in your expert opinion, would you say that Mrs. Hartley acted maliciously, or was she motivated by fear and desperation? Carter asked. Brooks hesitated, considering what to say. It is evident from the facts and my observations that Mrs. Hartley was experiencing severe emotional turmoil. The jury will determine whether her acts were planned or the outcome of that suffering. When Emma stood up, things started to change. She described how her marriage went from being a lovely union to a broken, terrible existence in a candid and poignant testimony. She talked about how much she loved Mark, how hard she tried to keep the marriage open, and how devastating it was to learn about his affair. With a shaky voice, Emma added, "I felt like I was losing myself. Because I loved him and wanted to keep our relationship intact, I consented to the open marriage. However, it felt as though my entire world fell apart when I learned that he intended to leave me. I had anxiety that evening. When he struck me, I simply reacted. This is not how I intended for it to end." As Emma concluded, the courtroom became silent, the weight of her words lingering. A diverse group of people from the community, the jury listened carefully and expressed a mixture of skepticism and empathy. Collins restated his position and emphasized Emma's deliberate acts in his concluding remarks. He pleaded with the jury to weigh the facts and return a guilty verdict. In her closing argument, Carter urged the jurors to view Emma as a victim of circumstance rather than a murderer. She portrayed a clear picture of a lady who was desperate for forgiveness and understanding after being pushed to the brink by a man who had destroyed her sense of security and trust. Days of deliberation later, the jury delivered its decision. As the foreman stood and declared, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Emma Hartley, guilty of involuntary manslaughter," the courtroom gasped. A rush of murmurs followed the collective gasp. Emma's expression was one of relief mixed with shock. Because she was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, the jury concluded that her acts were motivated by fear and desperation rather than by malice. Even if the punishment would be less severe, the effects would still change people's lives. Emma was given a 5-year prison sentence, with the potential of release after 3 years by the judge. Emma experienced an odd mixture of feelings as she was brought away. There was a ray of optimism, but the nightmare was far from finished. Justice had been served, but she still had hope for forgiveness, because her tale had been heard and told. Detective Brooks stayed in the courtroom for a little while longer, observing Emma walk out the door. He had a twinge of sympathy for her, a lady entangled in a web of betrayal and love and pushed to the brink. It served as a sobering reminder of the difficulties in human connections and their potential for darkness. It was a devastating conclusion to a tragic tale. The town gradually resumed its daily activities after being irrevocably altered by the Hartley case. But the ghosts of that tragic evening persisted, serving as a silent reminder of the fine line that separates love from hate and the terrible results that can result when it is crossed.